Everywhere has something they're known for, although usually it washes up on our shore. Little Italy and Chinatown, sitting there side by side. Live from New York, it's a French kiss, Italian ice, Spanish moss in the moonlight, just another American Saturday night. Welcome back to StillerBros at the Movies, where today we are going to be enjoying a little bit of Saturday Night Live early this week.
Yes. So, what's there to say about Saturday Night Live?
It's probably one of the biggest television institutions of the last 5 decades, to the point that imagining a world where it never existed would redefine how the cinematic landscape of our world exists.
It has spawned comedic geniuses, the likes of Dan Aykroyd, Bill Murray, Adam Sandler, the late great Chris Farley, all the way up to the more recent people such as Kristen Wiig and Bill Hader and Will Ferrell and even Kate McKinnon and Pete Davidson.
If it wasn't for Saturday Night Live, we wouldn't have things like Parks and Recreation, 30 Rock, The Office, or even the Marvel Cinematic Universe, if you can believe that.
It is just insane to think what an institution that Lorne Michaels created when he was only 30 years old.
And yeah, the thing of it is, it's kind of amazing to think that there was a time when Saturday Night Live seemed like this weird kind of punk rock thing that a bunch of comedians that no one had ever heard of were trying to pull off in New York.
And that's exactly what this movie is about. It is about the punk rock 20-something unknown comedians who somehow banded together and made pop culture history by creating the very first episode of Saturday Night Live 49 years ago tomorrow.
Now, we keep calling it punk rock, and that's kind of an exaggeration considering the fact that they were being backed by NBC, which was and still is one of the biggest TV networks existing today. But because it's the 70s comedy scene, it just kind of feels like they're getting away with something. I mean, the show was hosted by George Carlin, for God's sake.
Yeah.
But now SNL is like this proud standing comedic institution where hundreds of different comedic performers have made their way through to show the world who they truly are, some to more success than others.
Rob Schneider.
And one of those voices, if you can believe it, is Jason Reitman.
Yes, because obviously being the son of Ivan Reitman, he obviously had his fair share of exposure to a lot of the comedians who came up in SNL.
And while he didn't start his career at Saturday Night Live, he has worked at Saturday Night Live. He directed a short film way back.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people he has worked with, been famous for working with, have been at Saturday Night Live in one way or another.
And so when the time came around to come up with this idea, Jason Reitman had connections that he could contact to get the inside info about what happened on October 11th, 1975, the iconic night of that iconic broadcast.
Now, we can't pretend like Jason Reitman came out of nowhere. Obviously, because his dad directed Ghostbusters, he does have Dan Aykroyd's phone number. He grew up on the set of Ghostbusters. He knows a lot of the famous people. This is not just some director who managed to get inside access. This is a guy who basically sees Dan Aykroyd as his dad's friend.
So it's not exactly like he just somehow got in touch with them and made this movie. Him and Gil Kenan once again wrote this screenplay, like the other screenplay they wrote earlier this year.
You probably already forgot that they made that movie this year.
Yeah. But this is more than likely the project that he decided to jump into, which is why he could not come back to direct Frozen Empire.
Something a little more his speed. Because while Ghostbusters Afterlife, his last movie, was a full-on action comedy blockbuster, this is a straight-up comedy where most of the action is characters sitting around and talking with each other.
Yes. Well, not so much sitting around this time, because it is a more high-paced conversation, because it is taking place over the course in somewhat real time.
The idea is that this is the last 90 minutes before the first broadcast of Saturday Night Live, and all the chaos that ensues when you're talking about a live broadcast. Now, the trailers keep building up this idea that Saturday Night Live is like this big, out there idea that nobody has ever tried before, but live broadcasts have existed for about as long as television has existed, and sketch comedy has existed for about as long as live entertainment has existed, so I don't know what exactly the big twist that makes this a gamble is.
I think it's primarily just the fact that they were a bunch of 20-something virtual unknowns who were just kind of cobbling together an idea for a show.
Either way, Saturday Night Live, when it first aired, was a bit of a chaotic mess, and which is exemplified by the fact that the show really didn't know what it was at first. Like, now they have a very basic formula of cold open, monologue, commercial, sketch, musical guest. Why am I explaining the formula for Saturday Night Live to you people?
Yeah, you should know the structure of the show, really.
If you've seen a recent episode, you can probably guess exactly what kind of order everything's going to be in.
And of course, there's also just the fact that everybody has their era of SNL, whether it be the early 70s era or the 80s era with the likes of Eddie Murphy, to the 90s with Mike Myers and Will Ferrell and Adam Sandler and Farley and Spade, or even the 2000s with Hader and Wig and Sandberg.
And with a show going on for 50 seasons at this point, for historical context, episode 2 aired last Saturday, and episode 3 of season 50 airs this Saturday. But as is typical with something that's been going on for longer than like 5 seasons, there are a bunch of people who are insisting that it's not as good as it used to be, which I would argue is not really something that's the case. I think that mostly when people argue that any show has gone on too long and doesn't have the magic anymore, it's mostly because it's reached high heights to the point that the low lows are suddenly feel way lower. And that's made abundantly clear by the fact that I think Saturday Night Live has mostly had the same amounts of highs and lows throughout the years. Like, sometimes they'll have a high, like, oh look, the Lonely Island is back making another digital short, or sometimes they'll have a low, like the entire Elon Musk episode. But either way, the chaos of Saturday Night Live was really exemplified in what kind of show it was. It was more of a variety show with like weird musical performances and sketches that kind of went on a little longer than you'd expect, and experimental short films, which is why Jim Henson is part of the story in the first place,
even though his was not a pre-tape segment.
But on top of everything else, this has a myriad cast of people playing major stars from Saturday Night Live's past, and some even vaguely associated with Saturday Night Live.
We have leading the cast sort of as Lorne Michaels himself, Gabriel LaBelle, who kind of got his breakout by kind of playing Steven Spielberg in The Fablemans.
But then we also have Dylan O'Brien looking shockingly exactly like Dan Aykroyd.
And we have, of course, Jason Reitman, a regular, J.K. Simmons taking on the role of Milton Berle.
And Jim Henson isn't the only comedy legend that's being represented in this movie, because we also have the likes of Matthew Rhys as George Carlin, and
Nicholas Braun playing both Jim Henson and Andy Kaufman.
So basically, Nicholas Braun playing but 2 different kinds of comedy outsiders.
Yeah.
But this seems like an interesting movie, mostly because its comedy is built around the idea of, hey, these people were kind of interesting. Let's make a movie about this weird, crazy thing that they were particularly going nuts in.
I mean, we obviously have the conceit behind the fact that it's 90 minutes to a live broadcast.
This is like chaos, and apparently Reitman Kennan actually did interview the living cast members and people who were there, so obviously there are probably some stories that nobody's heard before.
Yeah.
And maybe there are just some stories that they made up, because if you're expecting a warts and all rundown of what happened that night on Saturday Night Live, prepare to be disappointed, because I think we as a society need to remember that biopics don't work like that.
Yeah.
Like, every single biopic ever created has some kind of bias attached to it. Some of the time, it's because of the people involved, family is involved. And in this case, it's because Jason Reitman just basically wanted to make this movie because he wanted to just kind of run around and be like, hey, look at these cool people my dad knew when he was new.
Yeah. But ultimately, as fans of comedy and still people who regularly watch a Saturday Night Live, we're excited to see what this is.
Because mostly the first episode is something we haven't looked at a lot.
Yeah. Early SNL is kind of a different animal to us than it is now.
Mostly because, as we pointed out, it was a lot more of this weird, offbeat, experimental thing that would have like, oh, let's do a weird dance number in the middle of this. Oh, let's have an experimental short film of some kind. Oh, let's throw some Jim Henson Muppets into the mix.
Oh, let's have Princess Leia at this teen beach party.
Which is somehow playing off of the monologue that they just did. The 70s were weird, and I'm glad we missed them.
Yeah.
Anyway, we've rambled, we've gone off on completely irresponsible tangents, but one way or another, we're going to see this movie.
Yes.
So, we'll see you guys after the jump. So, yeah, that was a pretty good version of what it was trying to do.
Yeah.
The thing about this movie is that it's a lot of creating somewhat artificial chaos to replicate the chaos that was the first episode of Saturday Night Live.
Now, we don't know the actual level of chaos, obviously, because we weren't there, but obviously they tried to stay as close to accurate to what actually happened as possible.
Like the real people who were involved in this and are still alive had definitely at least talked to the people involved in this movie. And so creating this kind of chaos, you're kind of thrown in the thick of it a lot of times, but you're also kind of feeling relaxed and at home.
You're also kind of learning a lot about what kind of stuff was going on behind the scenes that you probably didn't know. Like, Lorne was originally going to do Weekend Update of it before handing it off to Chevy when they went to air.
There's just a lot of interesting little tidbits about what goes into making a show like Saturday Night Live. Whether or not they're still running things like this is a complete mystery to us, but, you know, it's still kind of fun. And like I said, there's a lot of chaos in this. And part of how that is presented is that Jason Reitman decided to really play with working with single shots, running through this incredibly detailed practical set rebuilding of 30 Rockefeller Plaza.
Yeah, a 2-story practical set with a lot of one-ers where we're running around, mostly following Lorne as he goes through all of this stuff at once.
Occasionally another character will kind of take the camera, run it to a different part of the studio where actual interesting stuff is happening, and not just Lorne trying to figure out how to make X, Y, Z fit within the confines of the show.
This is an ensemble. It's not exactly a well-balanced ensemble because, again, we're kind of following Lorne for the most part throughout most of this.
But the little plotting there is in this movie is very thin, which I think is by design, because the idea is that we're following along as the show is barely coming together. So the idea of following any one particular person around just kind of leads you to question why you're even trying to create something like this. Lorne is basically our central character because this show is essentially supposed to be his baby, but we've also got little mini arcs for some of the characters, like Garrett Morris kind of wondering why he's here, Chevy Chase grappling with the fact that he might be destined for something bigger, John Belushi kind of questioning why he's even debasing himself for the sketches that he believes are kind of dumb and beneath him.
And it all kind of shows a character piece to these people that we get to experience along with them. Some of them obviously don't have as good of arcs, like Dan Aykroyd going through his kind of spiel for the night was a little bit just not really having an adequate end to what was going on with him.
It's just kind of, oh, Dan Aykroyd's here, and Dylan O'Brien does a pretty good impression of Dan Aykroyd's typical rambly speeches about whatever random crap he's thinking of at the moment.
Yes.
And, of course, we should just kind of talk about how the casting is so spot on that in the opening scene you almost don't know if it's archive footage or the actors recreating the original SNL auditions.
Yeah, because we do see the SNL auditions recreated by the actors, and the casting is so good for a lot of them that it's hard to tell.
Now, sometimes you can remember, oh right, this is an actor and not just them bringing the person back from 1975 just to pretend to do this for a movie. And sometimes you're just like, that is definitely Chevy Chase. That is definitely John Belushi. That is definitely Aykroyd and Curtin. And
they do a great job of taking these personalities and playing them as if we actually are seeing them again.
And occasionally Gabriel LaBelle kind of goes into the typical Lorne Michaels impression.
So obviously that's a big thing with this, especially because with this particular kind of true story movie, we know what a good chunk of these people sound like. So they have to do something of an impression, but also giving us their own take on these people.
And I mean, besides the cast on screen, we've also got a lot of very popular comedians who were working on Saturday Night Live behind the scenes. Like, I didn't realize that Billy Crystal was going to be in this movie, or Al Franken
and Paul Schaefer, and they have a few additional celebrities popping in to be part of the background.
And John Baptiste not only plays Billy Preston in this movie, but he also does the score. And one of my favorite aspects of this score is the fact that it very much sounds like the kind of music that you hear a band just kind of randomly plink away at while they're doing a sound check between scene transitions.
And that makes sense because they actually recorded the score on the sets with the band.
But it sounds perfectly matched to what they're attempting to do. The score matches this kind of improvisational feel of we've got an hour and a half to air. Let's just try to make sure that we've got everything down before we actually run this thing into the ground.
Yeah, and there's also a very kind of hopeful of something resembling a cinematic universe with the fact that we have a Jim Henson appearance with him talking about how he would like, in one particular scene, talks about how he would like to one day bring Muppets to television.
And then there's like Andy Kaufman doing a bunch of bits in the background. Nicholas Braun plays two characters, and I can understand why they gave him both Jim Henson and Andy Kaufman, because Andy Kaufman, in a true Andy Kaufman fashion, shows up at the beginning of the movie, and then he just kind of intermittently appears throughout the rest of it. And I'd say one of the weaker points of this is when they try to make it so that there's a villain of the movie.
Yeah.
Like, I like Willem Dafoe in this. I like the fact that there's stakes, that there's legitimate stakes in the idea that NBC is just one mess away from pulling the plug on this. But the fact that Willem Dafoe is in here as like this snarling villain, no, this show is not going to play under my watch. It's just like, it feels like the part that's like so true story movie.
Yeah.
Especially when you have the character of Dick Ebersol there, who in real life ended up being one of the two guys who took over as showrunner during the brief period when Lorne Michaels was gone.
And that was, of course, during the low point of the show in the early 80s. And then they got Eddie Murphy, and Lorne came back and brought the show back from the brink. And
I think if they had just done it where Dick Ebersol was kind of the more rational one, where Lorne was more of the irrational, it's gonna work because it has to work dreamer, I think that would have been enough of a conflict, along with the whole constant threat along with the smaller threat of Johnny Carson Tonight Show reruns hanging over their head, and less of we need a villain, and this NBC executive happened to be in the building at the time, so let's just make him less of a guy who needs to keep his business interests in mind and more just a villain.
Yeah, but at the same time, one thing I liked about this movie was that it was both very creatively inspiring, just watching this whole thing, this man's creative dream come together, but it was also very, very, very stress-inducing.
Because the focus of this movie is on a young man who is in way over his head. Like, Lorne Michaels was just this comedy writer who went in and was like, I've got an idea for a sketch comedy series. And then next thing you know, he's in the thick of it. He's got like 100 department heads depending on him. And he's dealing with the fallout of a lot of people asking him for answers that he doesn't have.
He's got the soundboards freaking out. He's got the lighting trellises falling down on the stage during rehearsal. He's got the bricks for home base getting installed as they were running around trying to get everything together.
It's just it's this chaotic thing. Now, it's not like Whiplash, also starring J.K. Simmons, where it feels like the kind of movie where I love it, but I need to be in a certain mood to watch it. Otherwise my brain will break. But it's also one of those things where it's like we've got this stress-inducing thing where a character has a goal and hopes to achieve it against all odds.
But it's also got that thing with true stories where you know they succeed, so you don't have to, so that kind of takes a lot of the pressure off.
Yeah, you know they succeed, because otherwise, why would they make the movie?
Especially because tomorrow is the 49th anniversary of that day.
And the fact that now, 49 years later, we, once again, like we said in the preconceptions, you can't imagine a world without Saturday Night Live.
And now Lorne is like the king of NBC late nights. Like Johnny Carson tried to bury him, well, he's now executive producer of The Tonight Show.
And late night. Basically, if it airs after a certain time on NBC, he's one of the executive producers on it.
Yeah.
So late great Johnny Carson kind of missed his call there. But then that anecdote about him calling Chevy Chase after the Chevy Chase talk show, his first episode, and saying it's not so hard, is it? That's, on the other hand, is gold. But yeah, I think this movie really did what it set out to do. It's a smaller movie, but it's also built on the idea that these people just kind of ended up being the start of something.
It really feels like these people coming together and becoming kind of connected forever by being part of this thing that eventually will grow to be bigger than any of these people ever thought it would be when they stood on that stage for the first time.
I also love the fact that as a true story movie, it doesn't fall into one of the usual traps of true story movies where it foreshadows events that we know are going to happen. Like, it doesn't wallow in the tragedy of John Belushi or Gilda Radner's unfortunate deaths. It just kind of allows them to be as they were that night.
And it doesn't really try to foreshadow anything that will happen down the road for a lot of these people. There is no Bill Murray post-credit scene, sadly.
There's no scene where they cut away from the first episode doing well to suddenly like a young Chris Rock looking at the TV and being like, that's what I want to do. It's just a movie that allows these people to just put on a show and then move on with the rest of their lives, because this is a job for them and they did their job successfully.
Yeah.
And yeah, what else is there to say? Saturday Night kind of nails it.
Yeah.
And I don't see what else there is to say. It's a pretty good version of what it tries to be, and that's more than enough.
Yeah.
So, I think that's it. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel, leave in the comments what you may or may not have thought about Saturday Night, and don't forget to tune in next time when, screw it, Venom. Next time, Venom.